Hey, Steve Mignani here doing the Junkyard Crawl with assistance from my friends at High Octane Classics in Auburn, Massachusetts. Thank you. And I like to say that the junkyard is more than a place for old cars to come and rust away. It's also a classroom. This is a 1951 Chevrolet, and we all know that in the post-World War II years, American cars went through an astonishing metamorphosis, from mere transportation devices to rolling dream cars. Now, 1951 here, it had the envelope body, kind of bulbous, the jet age themes on the hood. Of course, World War II, we saw jet aircraft begin to go from military and then finally to passenger service. The future was now. Well, as we move forward into the 50s, we see a lot of advances like Chevrolet's XFrame. If you look at this is a 61 Chevy, but with that said, this XFrame arrived in 1958. It was used through 1964. The whole point of the X was that it allowed the floor pans, the passenger's foot areas, to go down into those voids on the side of the X, which then allowed the rest of the body to also be draped down lower over the frame. It was good for styling, but if you'll notice, there's no side beams, so if you get T-boned by a car going anything more than 40 miles an hour, chances are it was going to deform the door and come on in. But with that said, the X-frame was an interesting revelation and a step toward the lower, wider, longer styling aesthetic that came into the 50s. This is a 57 Chevrolet, final year for the perimeter frame, which of course was part of why it sat so tall and boxy. These are known as shoebox Chevys for a reason. They're tall and pretty boxy. This is a Mopar from 1957. And something interesting and unique to Mopar starting in 1957 is what we see here. Now, there were still full frame cars. We can see, unlike GM, which had the X-frame, Chrysler stuck with a perimeter frame, but it wasn't as far out to the perimeters as like a 55 Chevy. Rather, Chrysler used the frame sort of like a ladder down the middle of the car, still a good 1.5 feet on each side, not unprotected, but again, different from GM's X-frame motif. But more importantly, 57 brought these. These are torsion bars, and instead of the coil springs used by GM and Ford, which would have been on top of the front suspension member, these torsion bars are anchored at the back, and then they twist as the front wheels want to go up and down. So torsion bars were a way that allowed Chrysler engineers to have a lower cowl height and engine bay design. And the only downside of these, and I love these things, but if you ever try to have a torsion bar equipped Mopar like a Roadrunner or a Charger, these things were used into the 70s. If you run headers, they want to go right where the torsion bars are. You have to bang your headers with a hammer. But with that said, the upside is that there's no shock towers under the Mopar's hood. You can put as wide an engine as you want, or even two of them almost, under the hood of a Mopar with torsion bars. Now, this is a DeSoto. I believe this is probably a 1959. And again, DeSoto was on its last legs, would be gone after, in mid-61, early 61, DeSoto went away. Inside the trunk of this one, we can see body on frame construction. I think when we go to the other side, we'll learn more. 1960 brought semi-unitized construction to all Chrysler full-size, except for Imperial. And on this one, yeah, this is going to be a 59. We know that because it has the full perimeter frame. Again, for 1960, this frame would go away and the underside would have welded on thinner gauge frame rails that were part of the floor pan. And up front would be a sort of a stub frame that would bolt up underneath the driver's seat and go forward to accept the engine and suspension. So in 1959 here, final year for the perimeter frame under Chrysler full-size products. This here is a Dodge, about a 1956 or 55. And again, with this, we see the final year, 56, for Chrysler's coil spring suspension. Again, very much like GM and Ford, conventional stuff. The coils sit here between a lower control arm and a hard point. And as they compress, they resist, and that's your suspension. So again, no torsion bars until 57. So that's a 56 right there. Again, we see the perimeter frame underneath, which helped to allow lower body styling, but not as much as the GM X-frame did in 58, which is truly revolutionary in many ways. And on this one, we also see, the floor long gone, but here are the mounts where the body would bolt to 1, 2, 3, 4, and a couple down the back. So like 8 or 9 spots where the body would mount. Now, the body wasn't mounted rigidly to the frame. These are rubber bushings right here, which theoretically allowed the body to kind of float on the frame, sort of like a cushion of rubber, kind of, sort of. They also tend to want to crack and fall apart. We can see this right here. And when that happens, you got a shudder and a noise. So these were born to stay new forever, which didn't really happen. But again, it was a step in the direction of better ride quality. This here is an Oldsmobile. We can see here the gun sights. This is probably a 1957, 56, 57, maybe a 58. But again, we go to this one here, we see Oldsmobiles, coil spring front suspension. Olds never toyed with torsion bars until we get to the 66 Tornado, which of course was front engine, front drive, torsion bars. But again, this is a much more traditional Olds platform. But notice the difference on the frame here. The Oldsmobile utilized both a perimeter frame with the out rails mounted closer to the side for side impact protection, but also with a stiffening X-brace underneath. Now look at this, that's almost bridge girder stuff right there. That is thick, and that is one of the ways that full-size Oldsmobiles, you know, achieved a sort of a bank vault quietness. Well, that's maybe overstating it, but again, same body mounts here that you see on pretty much any car with a full frame. The rubber always degrades, but the idea was that the body would mount to these things and float on the frame. Again, this X-frame required an interesting drive shaft design. Drive shaft had to go through this tunnel right here, and it went from the engine to the rear axle through this X, which was kind of a nightmare for service. Now on Oldsmobile, the drive shaft was a one-piece affair, but in Chevrolet land, they actually had an intermediate support, a two-piece drive shaft. And if you look at any 58 through 64 Chevy, they have a two-piece drive shaft. And if you know your drag racing, Dino Don Nicholson, etc., the drive shaft was fairly reliable, but again, it was more problematic when it came to servicing because the center support could kind of wear out and the drive shaft would start to orbit. But on Oldsmobile, it was a one-piece unit. So each of the GM divisions, Cadillac, Olds, Pontiac, Chevrolet, Buick, all had their own way of doing things. And that comes right down to the rear axle. This is the Oldsmobile massive Hotchkiss style rear axle. And if you thought a Ford 9-inch was big, well, you got to look at this thing. These are 9.38 inches in diameter, inside big ring gear, and you could get an Eaton limited slip in these things after I think 57, 58. And that was the choice of drag racers from Don Garlits, you know, Chrisman, all these guys ran these kind of axles in their dragsters, the front engine dragsters that used to be so popular before rear engine cars arrived from Don Garlits 71 on. But again, this axle right here is gold. If you're building a proper retro gasser, that's the axle you need. You don't want to use a Ford 9-inch or a Mopar 8-3/4 or a Dana. That is what you want. An Oldsmobile or a Pontiac, both very good. But something we see on this too is leaf springs at the back. You get into 1958. This is going to be a 57 for sure, but 58 would have seen these leaf springs replaced with coil springs, I'm pretty sure, on the Oldsmobile. So again, this is sort of a remnant of the horse and buggy days when leaf springs were the quickest, easiest, strongest way to support the weight of the vehicle, the buggy, or the car. And again, leaf springs. The only downside of leaf springs, theoretically, is that they allow a little more axle shudder and maybe not the smoothest boulevard ride, but Chrysler Imperial used leaf springs right into the 1980s, so they can't be that bad. And one final detail on this thing is the dual exhaust. Again, 1950s, if you had a V8 under the hood, you shouted loud and proud with V's on the front, V's on the back. At the rear of the car, dual exhaust, because it showed there was a V engine under the hood. And like a fighter plane in World War II, V configuration was the way to win the battle. Well, on these Oldsmobiles, the rear bumper was formed in a way that was ready for standard dual exhaust, but you paid extra for it, or you got it with the upscale car. Down here, we can see the original die-cast insert, which is where the exhaust might have exited, sometimes down the bottom. But on this end, we go up to here, and you can see the die-cast. What's this block off? Well, the bumper was designed for dual exhaust, but they didn't all get it. This was a single exhaust Olds. The pipe would have come down here. But again, it goes to show that Olds predicted that more people would go for the dual exhaust than not. So the bumper was born to have dual exhaust, but when it wasn't specified, you got a block-off plate. Interesting, the psychology of the 1950s. And finally, we notice on this one, the gas filler is located right there, kind of like on a 56 Chevy, hidden in plain sight. This little piece here, the trim panel opens and closes, and you gotta love the rust here in New England. I don't want to, but I mean, I will say that these cars, are they restorable? If you had NASA's budget, you know, for a moonshot, you could probably restore this car with no problem at all. But with that said, this is more of a part stone, but more than that, it's a classroom. And I got to say that, you know, yards like this one here, it's located in Vermont. That's all we can say right now. They deserve protected status. I dare say that these are historic monuments. These are places, the repositories of American industrial history. These are not eyesores. These are not junkyards. These are museums. And I think it might be time to start talking with legislators about protecting places like this from nuisance laws, because it's not a nuisance. As long as you cover things up, these kinds of places, when we lose them, it's a tragedy. So with that said, that's the end of this particular junkyard classroom tour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Junkyard Crawl, and register or sign up or subscribe, all that stuff. We'll be back tomorrow every day, a new video here at Junkyard Crawl.